Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be telling you about all of the books that I read in the month of March for the Irish Readathon. As you can tell for the title, I read a whopping 15 books this month, which I'm really pleased with. But that has got me thinking, would you prefer if I'm reading that amount of books if I would do 2 wrap-ups each month, either 2 at the end of the month or like a mid-month wrap-up, which I know a lot of people do. When you see a wrap-up that's like half an hour long, which is what I'm expecting this will be, if not more, does it really put you off? Like, do you find that you have the stamina to get through a video that is that long? Because it's completely understandable if not. If I'm reading like the same amount of books next month, I might try it out and see how I get on with doing like a mid-month wrap-up. So yeah, the Irish Readathon. The Irish Readathon, it took place for the entirety of March and I had a really great time. I hosted this readathon alongside 3 of my very good booktube friends, Aoife, Jessica and Stephen, and honestly I think one of my favourite things about this readathon was how I got so much closer to those people as my friends. I think hosting this readathon was a really great bonding experience for us, and I just think they're all great. In this month we were trying to promote and encourage people to pick up Irish literature, be it just one book or, as I did, all of your reading in March being by Irish authors. I didn't get to film all of the videos that I had planned for this readathon. I just didn't end up having the time to get everything that I wanted done, but we did make a number of fantastic videos that I'm really proud of throughout the month. So I really do think the readathon was a huge success. I'm really pleased that so many of you took part as well. I'm really pleased with how it went. We did set some challenges for this readathon which were optional, and I will talk about which books I read for which challenge as I go along. Because this is going to be quite a long one, I am going to split up the types of books that I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to start by talking about YA, then I'm going to move into like contemporary adult fiction, and then I'm going to move into classics, plays and poetry. So the first book I'm going to talk about is Moonrise by Sarah Crossan. Sarah Crossan is a YA author that I've read a lot from in the past, and that has left me with very mixed feelings on her work. The first book I read by her is called One, and I think it's a phenomenal book. I would highly recommend it. The other 2 books that I've read from her I enjoyed a lot less. Moonrise, I would say, is kind of like my second favourite. This is told from the perspective of a teenage boy whose older brother is on death row, and it's about how that has affected his life and also him rebuilding his relationship with his older brother. And I thought this book was about a really important subject matter. I thought it was really well written. Sarah Crossan uses the verse form throughout all of her novels, which I think results in this really interesting stream of consciousness style, and it's a brilliant way of being very present with the narrator. And because of the way her books are written, the format in which they are written, they are really quick reads. Like, I have read 2 of her books, including this one, on my lunch break at work. What I keep finding with Sarah Crossan books is that they're not as good as One. And I think that's like an issue that you have when you read an author's arguably best work. You'll go on to read more of their books and they just won't compare. I would recommend this one if you are interested in that genre of like YA books told through verse. But one that I would recommend even more is The Space Between by Meg Grehan. Again, this one is written in verse, giving it that very present stream of consciousness kind of style. This is about a young woman who suffers from anxiety, and this is genuinely one of the most accurate depictions of anxiety that I have ever read. I do suffer from anxiety, although I have kind of really worked on my coping mechanisms over the past few years, and I definitely don't suffer from it as much as I used to. But this book definitely made me feel very validated in the things that I used to do because of my anxiety. This book is also a female romance, which I really appreciated, and it was really nice that the romance this wasn't like a coming out story. This wasn't someone coming to terms with their sexuality. This was just 2 girls falling for each other. This book also features a very cute dog, so if that's something you're into, then I would highly recommend this book. It was actually Aoife who recommended this book to me, and the moment I got to the cute dog, I was like, oh, okay, this makes sense now. This is one that I would definitely recommend if you are interested in verse, if you are interested in really great female romances, if you are interested in seeing accurate depictions of anxiety, and if you like books that have really beautiful covers. The next YA book I read was Snobs, Dogs and Scobies by Elizabeth O'Hara. Now let me tell you about my relationship with this book. So I didn't realise when I bought this book that I actually studied this in school. kind of. The book was originally published in Irish under the title Her Lama Book, and under the author's name being Eilish Ní Shubhna. I knew the author was the same person, but I didn't realise this was the translation of Her Lama Book, and I studied that story for my Irish exam in school. There were like 4 of us that did higher level Irish in school, which was really, I think it was pretty rare for our school because it wasn't an Irish speaking school. I think most people took the ordinary level paper, and on the higher level paper you needed to study a novel. We did not read the novel in Irish or in English. We read like a summary of it. The poor quality of my Irish language education in school is an entirely different video that I could talk about for ages. Basically, I already had the rough gist of this story, or at least I thought. I don't know why in school they didn't at least get us to read the English translation of this book, because at least then I would have known what actually happened, because my idea of what went on in this book was very different to what actually happens. This is a book about 3 Irish teenagers who are all preparing to sit the Leaving Cert, which is the exams that I just spoken about. It's about the stress of those exams, and if you have taken the Leaving Cert, I don't know if you have the same experience as me, but I still have stress dreams and anxiety dreams about the Leaving Cert. So it's about that stress. It's about how doing those exams aren't the path for every one of these teenagers. It is about these teenagers who are from very different backgrounds forming friendships. It's a book about grief, and I had no idea of the big thing that happens in this book that leads to one of the characters experiencing a lot of grief. I feel like that's something I should have known about when I studied it. It's a book about escaping, and it's a book about leaving Ireland. Significant chunks of this book are set in Wales, and I had no idea about that. Overall, I thought this was a really nice story. And it is one of the most accurate depictions I've seen of what it is like to be someone who's doing the Leaving Cert. It's not something that has necessarily left me thinking about it that much, but nonetheless, I thought it was a really nice little read. Moving on to the contemporary adult fiction, I'm going to start with Almost Love by Louise O'Neill, and I have done a full review video of this, which I will leave linked down below, but I absolutely loved this book. This was the first book I've read this year that I just entirely, completely loved. This is a book that is told in multiple timelines, so we have the then and the now. In the now, we follow a character named Sarah who is in a relationship with a man named Oisin. It's a very comfortable relationship. But from the then sections, the sections of the novel which are in the past, we see that Sarah is still dealing with the effects of a very bad relationship she was in with an older man. It's a book about obsession and how we can be tricked into thinking feelings of obsession are feelings of love. It's a book about not feeling good enough. It's a book about the bad things that good people do, and it's a book about trying to forgive. It's a book about grief. It's a book about what it's like to move away from your family. It's written superbly, and I think this book is a depiction of the traumas that a lot of young women go through that we don't often talk about publicly. What I keep saying about this book is that while the situations in this book weren't exactly like situations I had gone through, you know, they were similar in some ways, but they were very different. Louise still managed to see into like my most intimate thoughts, like thoughts that I've never really articulated to people. She was able to put onto the page. I do have way more thoughts on this book, so I will leave my review linked down below if you want to hear more of them. But overall, I adore this book so much. Very soon after reading Almost Love, I listened to the audiobook of The Lesser Bohemians by Emer McBride. And first off, I want to say I highly recommend listening to the audiobooks of Emer McBride's work. Her books are written in a very stream of consciousness style. There's very like sharp, short sentences that are barely like sentences at all. And her writing is also very, very poetic. She also narrates the audiobooks, which was absolutely brilliant because obviously she completely understood how things were meant to be said. And I understand why a lot of people would struggle with the writing style of this book, but I think the audiobook is a great way if you think you're going to struggle with that. But the reason why this was so interesting after reading Almost Love is because this also features a relationship between a young girl and a much older man. This is about an 18-year-old Irish girl who travels to London in order to go to drama school. It's set in the 1990s, and it definitely like really feels like it's set in the 1990s. She's very naive, and I think she's very much struck when she comes to London, how she's fitting into the culture there, who she is. She's figuring all of that out. And then she meets an established actor who is 20 years her senior. And they begin a relationship. And initially it seems like it's a relationship that is purely about bad power dynamics. It seems very similar to the relationship in Almost Love, in that you have an older man just taking advantage of this younger, more naive girl. But as the novel progresses, you realize that these are two characters who are clinging to each other. And that's not to say it makes the power imbalance in the relationship okay, but they are two people that have so much trauma in their background and in their childhood that they just cling to one another. I don't want to say too much more other than that, but I thought this was a really phenomenally written book and I would highly recommend it. If you have read Almost Love and enjoyed it, then I think this would be one that you'd be interested in reading as well. As I said, I would highly recommend the audiobook. Another book I read this month was Oh My God, What a Complete Aisling by Emer McLysaght and Sarah Breen. And I budgie read this with Gabby and that was such an enjoyable experience. I will leave her channel linked down below so you can check her out. This book is contemporary women's fiction and it was born from a Facebook page of things that were just kind of like relatable for young Irish women. There were lots of things I loved about this book and lots of things I really didn't like about this book. So our protagonist is called Aisling. She is a young woman who is from the countryside in Ireland and she commutes up to Dublin for work in an office job. She's in a very long-term relationship with her boyfriend and she's kind of waiting for him to propose. And it's about her figuring her life out after he doesn't do that. It's about her learning about her own independence and figuring her own identity out. It's about her mixing with different kinds of people and what she learns from those experiences. It's about her becoming friends with people that she wouldn't have necessarily wanted to be friends with before. It's about her beginning to understand what she actually wants from a romantic relationship. It's about her family relationships. My main criticism of this book is how it's really trying to be like hashtag relatable. So everything that she like uses is branded. So she doesn't just use moisturizer. She's always using like the Clinique whatever moisturizer. She's never just using fake tan. She's always using Sally Henson. And it got to a point where me and Gabby were wondering like, are there actual like brand deals in this book for advertising? And there's one section of the novel where she goes on like a night out and all of the songs that she hears are mentioned and it's very contemporary. Like there are songs that if you went into a club tonight, they're the songs that you would hear. They're going to make the book age really poorly. Like music and pop music is a really great way of grounding in a book in a particular time. And I think that works really well if you're writing about like a decade that has already gone by. I don't think it's great if you're writing a contemporary book, but what this book sets out to do is to get as many people talking about it as possible. And I know it's a book that is for the kind of girl that is the protagonist, and it's a book that's trying to get word of mouth going about it by people going, oh my God, this book is so me, and then talking to their friends about it. But it just meant that the writing style wasn't really for me. The last quarter of this book was what I thought was the most strong. And throughout this book, I was wondering, oh, this is a book that's all about contemporary Irish womanhood. Are they going to address Repeal the 8th? And I wasn't sure if they would deal with like a divisive issue in a book that's meant to be, oh my God, this is so me. But dealing with thoughts around abortion is something that is, oh my God, so me for Irish women. And I think how this book dealt with Repeal the 8th was done really, really, really well. It dealt with women who have different kinds of experiences around the issue, women from different like class positions and how class affects access to abortion. And I just thought that whole section of the book was done extremely well. So if you're looking for like a mostly very fun, although at moments also extremely touching contemporary women's fiction read, I would really recommend this one. I did enjoy it a lot. I'm glad I read it. But the first 3/4 of the novel aren't really something that I'm going to be left thinking about. The next book I read was A Line Made by Walking by Sarah Baum. This also features a young Irish female protagonist. Our protagonist is 25-year-old Frankie, who has kind of lost her sense of self. both personally and in terms of being an artist. She does a lot of photography. She's a photographer. She's also dealing with a lot of mental health issues. She's dealing with grief, and she decides that she's going to almost retreat to her grandmother's cottage. Her grandmother has passed away, and that's also something that she's dealing with throughout this book. As she spends time in this cottage, she is learning more and more about her relationship with herself, her relationship with the natural world, her relationship with her art. It's an incredibly rich and intimate book, and it's a book about what isolation can do for you. And I think when we think about isolation, we often think of it as a negative thing, but I think the isolation that Frankie experiences in this book is something that really benefits her, because it does give her that space to breathe and that space to work things out. Also, if you are someone that is interested in art, this book will be really interesting for you, because there are these really fun little sections where Frankie is thinking about something, or something becomes relevant, and she will sort of like test herself. So like she'll see what pieces of art that she can remember that are about that certain thing. This is an element of the book that slightly went over my head, because I'm not familiar with all of these pieces of work that she talks about, but I think if you are interested in art, this would be a brilliant touch to the novel for you. After reading those 4 books, so Almost Love, The Lesser Bohemians, oh my god, what a complete ashling, and A Line Made by Walking, I just felt like writing an essay on contemporary Irish young womanhood. Next book I read, I guess, is a lot more about contemporary Irish young manhood, and that is The Blood Miracles by Lisa McInerney. This is the follow-up to The Glorious Heresies, which was one of my favourite books that I read in 2017. I thought this was a really great follow-up. It takes one of the characters from The Glorious Heresies, Ryan Cusack, and it makes him the protagonist of this book. It's about Ryan's increasing involvement in gangland culture in County Cork, and the drug cartel that he becomes involved in, and how the people in his life are very dangerous, and his relationships with those people are really making it difficult for him to form any intimate or romantic relationships. It's a book about class in Ireland. It's a book about crime in Ireland. It's about those people that end up stuck in situations, in bad crime-filled situations, and they feel like they cannot escape them. This book is just as punchy and visceral, cynical, raw, and touching as The Glorious Heresies was. It's written really well. I think the use of colloquialisms are really strong in this book. And you don't need to have read The Glorious Heresies to read this book. Although I think if you have, it adds even more texture to the group of people that this book is about. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one as well. Moving on to some of the classic works that I read for the Irish Readathon. The next 2 books I'm going to talk about together because they are part of the same series, and they are Wildflower Girl and Fields of Home, both by Marie to Conlan-mckenna. These are the 2nd and 3rd books in the Children of the Famine series, of which Under the Hawthorn Tree is the 1st book. I thought these books carried on directly after the 1st book. There are quite significant time gaps between them. Wildflower Girl is predominantly about the youngest of 3 siblings who survived the famine in the 1st book. Peggy is now 13 years old, and in the 1st book I think she was about 7. And this book is about Peggy making the decision to move to America at such a young age in order to find employment and a better life. I think a lot of the time when we think of the people that emigrated as a result of the famine, we think they arrived in America and everything was just fine. And it wasn't. Peggy does go through a lot of hardships. Her labour is taken advantage of a lot. I guess in this book what we're following is her trying to make a new home away from home. Fields of Home is looking at the perspective of all 3 of the siblings, and it has a lot to do with economic circumstances. So we have the eldest sister, Ely, who is trying to make her family life work and provide for her family. It's about her relationship with her now husband. We're still following Peggy, who is remaining in America. And we also have Michael, who is the only boy in these siblings. He's the middle child, and he's become a stable boy for a very wealthy English landlord. And I would say his perspective is the main focus of this final novel, and it's a lot to do with the relationships between landlords and tenants and staffs. It's a lot to do with the class structures that are there. We also have a 4th character who is Mary Bridget, who is Ely's daughter, and I think being her perspective really captures the anxiety in Ireland at this time. It was a time of so much turbulence and change for all three of the siblings and then for Mary Bridget. I think this trilogy of books are really fantastic. I think they showcase the incredible hardships that Irish people have gone through throughout history, but they're also really hopeful and optimistic novels with happy endings. So next up, I finally read A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. I feel exactly about this book how I anticipated to feel. I'm pretty indifferent to it. I understand why this book would have been really radical and thought-provoking at the time it was published. So you've got to give it props for that. I just feel like I have read many more nuanced, interesting, diverse conversations about Irish nationalism. But you do have to understand that this would be very radical when it was published, and to speak out so publicly against Catholicism, to try and view it more complexly, it would have been scandalous. This is about a young man named Stephen Dedalus who is figuring himself out. He's trying to forge his own identity. It's a book about art and family and Ireland itself. What I didn't like about this book is how it just goes off in tangents. And I get that that's part of the writing style. Like, this is written in stream of consciousness, but it is very different to the stream of consciousness in the Lesser Bohemians, which I really enjoyed. The stream of consciousness in this is a lot of run-on sentences, but also thoughts like here, there, and everywhere. Like, he'll be talking about one thing, and then he'll suddenly have like 10 pages talking about something else. That isn't something that I really got on with. I think when you say that you're not a fan of Joyce, a lot of people jump to you like not getting it and not understanding it. And it's like, no, I get it, I just don't care that much. So I've read 2 books by James Joyce now. I've read Dubliners and I've read this. I know I'm never going to be someone that tries out Ulysses. I might give Finnegan's Wake a go, but yeah, I just don't think Joyce is the guy for me, but I'm glad his work exists. It's kind of similar to how I felt about this next book, to be honest with you. I read The Playboy of the Western World and Other Plays by J.M. Synge. So J.M. Synge is a really highly influential Irish playwright. He played a massive role in the Anglo-Irish literary revival. This is something that I originally wanted to make a video on this month, but I just didn't really have time. The Playboy of the Western World was a play that caused a lot of riots in Dublin when it was first performed in the Abbey Theatre because it was seen as extremely insulting to Irish people. I think a lot of people saw Synge's work as him being this like Anglo-Irish posh boy who went to stay down in the Aran Islands and then wrote really insulting depictions of the Aran people. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think his plays were a lot more nuanced than people then gave them credit for, although I understand why they were so controversial at the time. I do think J.M. Synge was presenting depictions of Irishness and especially Irish womanhood that a lot of Irish people weren't ready to accept. I think we had this very romantic notion of the Irish countryside and this very romantic notion of Irish women, this ideal Irish womanhood that's like Mary the Virgin Mother, when actually Irish women were a lot more complex than that, and they did do bad things and they did take charge of their households. So I actually enjoyed J.M. Synge's depiction of Irish women and the people from the Aran Islands, but I didn't necessarily find the plots of any of these plays particularly memorable. The Playboy of the Western World is the most memorable of them. It is about a man who shows up at this couple's doorstep, and he says that he has murdered his father, and then he becomes like a local hero, and then his father shows up and you find out that he hasn't actually murdered his father. I can't even remember which one it was, but there's also one where a woman has an affair. These plays didn't necessarily stay with me or make me think in terms of the plots of them, but in terms of its presentation of the characters, I thought it was really interesting, and they are something that I would like to do some further reading on, because I don't know if I'm missing something and these are actually really insulting to Irish people. Maybe it's something I'm not getting because I'm not from the countryside, but I actually found the characterization in these plays really interesting. Another Irish play that I read this month was one that I really, really loved, and that was Brian Friel's Dancing at Lunasa. I am really impressed that this play was written by a man because it is such an interesting exploration of womanhood. This book is predominantly about 5 sisters who are all living together, and they are all formidable women in different ways. They all have different interests and pursuits. They have strength in different ways. The 2 male characters that we have are their brother, who is a missionary priest that has been sent home because he's lost his faith. And then we have the narrator, I think his name is Michael, and he is a really interesting character because he narrates the play as an adult. It's him looking back on these events of his childhood. But his childhood self is also a character in the play, but he doesn't actually appear. It's the adult actor that would read the child's lines. And this play has so much to do with patriarchal structures, both in terms of the actual plot of it, but also in the style of it. The narrator, as I mentioned, is a man, and that's how systematic pressures like the patriarchy use language as a tool and as a weapon and to control how people have power and how they communicate. But this play is about how these 5 women go against those structures. One of the most famous parts of this play is when the women just burst into dance, and it is noted that they dance against the beat of the music. You know, that's clearly a metaphor for them going against what they're expected to do, going against the status quo, and just doing whatever the hell they want. I really liked this play. I thought it was really, really good. And the final 2 books, again, I'm going to talk about these 2 together, that I read for the Irish Readathon were Seamus Heaney's 2 poetry collections, Human Chain and District and Circle. I have a lot of thoughts on Seamus Heaney, and I've done a whole big long analytical video about what I think about his poetry, which I will leave linked down below. And I do have some additional thoughts now that I have read these 2 collections. We'll briefly tell you a little bit about what these collections are specifically about, but I am going to talk somewhat broadly about Seamus Heaney's poetry. District and Circle is a really interesting one because it is moving away from Ireland, you know, as District and Circle suggests. It's the most contemporary that I've read from Seamus Heaney, while still returning to the things that fascinate him, so a sense of identity, childhood. And Human Chain is very much about relationships. So it's the relationships between parent and child, between husband and wife. Firstly, I'm going to say that I thought both of these collections were brilliant, but I also want to talk about how reading Seamus Heaney's poetry made me feel like home, and I mean that on a number of different levels. I don't mean because his poetry is dealing with Ireland. That's not really what I mean. I do mean that obviously he is dealing with domesticity a lot. Lots of mentions of stoves and kettles. That of course does make you feel like home. But when I read Seamus Heaney's poetry, I feel like I'm coming home poetically. Seamus Heaney's poetry was the first poetry that I began to analyse independently and made me realise that I can analyse poetry and that I enjoy analysing poetry. Because of the long-standing relationship I've had with his poetry, having studied it at a number of different academic levels, I feel very well equipped to analyse his poetry. I know what I'm looking for. I feel very confident and comfortable in his poetry, both in subject matter and style. You know, a lot of the sound effects that he uses are something that I feel very well equipped to analyse, but it also made me realise how much his use of sound effect has influenced my own writing. And it also made me feel really nice in that Seamus Heaney continuously has a lot of similar preoccupations in his work. That's something I spoke about in my full video on his poetry. He has these themes and these ideas that he comes back to explore again and again and again. And if Seamus Heaney can come back to the same idea again and again and again, it makes me feel less bad that I write every other poem about womanhood and about abortion rights, and just really cements to me that as writers we often have these preoccupations that we come back to again and again in our work, and that is completely valid, and it doesn't make you a one-trick pony, not by any means. I just had a really nice time reading these books. So yeah, they are all the books that I read in March. I read quite a few. Do let me know down below if you do think it's a better idea to have 2 wrap-ups at the end of the month, or a mid-month wrap-up, because I do feel like a lot of people are put off by half-an-hour videos, which is completely understandable. Let me know if you have read any of the books that I spoke about down below, and we can have a little chat about them. Are you interested in reading any of them? Do let me know. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will talk to you guys in my next video.